The Soviet Union promised a workers' paradise, but at its core was the Gulag, a vast network of forced labor camps. Officially called the Main Administration of Corrective Labor Camps, it was a sanitized name for a brutal reality. The Gulag's purpose: punish enemies and exploit their labor for state projects. Millions were swept into this system, their lives reduced to a calculation of labor output versus survival. Prisoners built canals, railways, and mined resources in the harshest climates, fueling the 5-year plans. State propaganda celebrated these achievements, omitting the starvation, disease, and mass death beneath them. The Gulag was not a byproduct, but a deliberate tool of state policy, an attempt to build an industrial superpower through modern slavery. Over 18 million people passed through its gates. Millions died from exhaustion, malnutrition, or execution. Yet for all its cruelty, the Gulag was economically disastrous. Productivity was abysmal, and the system devoured resources while destroying its workforce. The Soviet dream was built on suffering, and the cost was a legacy of waste and tragedy. The Gulag's economic role was staggering in scale. By the early 1950s, over 2.5 million prisoners formed a captive workforce, essential to the Soviet command economy. The NKVD ran hundreds of enterprises: logging, mining, construction, producing much of the nation's gold, diamonds, coal, and timber. Prisoners built entire cities like Norilsk and Magadan and laid thousands of kilometers of railway, including the infamous Road of Bones. Survival was a daily struggle. Impossible quotas, starvation rations, and a barter economy where bread was more valuable than gold. The system was riddled with corruption. Camp commanders falsified reports, and projects like the White Sea Baltic Canal were celebrated despite being nearly useless. The Gulag consumed lives and resources for projects that often had little real value. Its output came at a terrible human cost, and its inefficiency was masked by propaganda and deception. The Soviet economy ran on the suffering of its prisoners, but the true price was hidden in the shadows. The legacy, a nation built on forced labor, haunted by the waste and loss. The numbers reveal not triumph, but tragedy. Vorkuta, deep in the Arctic Circle, epitomized the Gulag's logic. Built by prisoners to mine coal for Soviet industry, it was a city of suffering. Winter temperatures plunged below -40. Prisoners marched miles to mines, underfed and exposed. Disease, frostbite, and mine accidents were rampant. Life expectancy was measured in months. The state replaced the dead with new prisoners, viewing loss as a cost of business. Despite immense sacrifice, the economic rationale was flawed. Starving prisoners were far less productive than free workers. Maintaining the camps consumed vast resources, making forced labor more expensive than alternatives. After the Gulag's collapse, Vorkuta's mines closed, leaving ghost towns and decaying infrastructure. Vorkuta stands as a stark symbol: immense effort, little prosperity, and a legacy of sorrow. The dream of conquering nature and people ended in desolation. Soviet propaganda recast the Gulag as a place of reforging, transforming enemies into model citizens through labor. Films and books showed smiling prisoners, but the reality was brutality, impossible quotas, and dehumanization. The system ran on tufta, faked work and falsified reports, creating an illusion of productivity. Projects like the White Sea Baltic Canal were praised, but built at the cost of thousands of lives and were barely functional. The Dead Road, a railway across the Arctic, was abandoned after Stalin's death, its purpose lost to history. The Gulag's economic output was a mirage, built on deception and waste. Propaganda hid the irrationality and cruelty at the system's core. The myth of victorious labor masked a reality of suffering and failure. The Gulag was a society of its own, with brutal hierarchies and a desperate economy of survival. Trustees held power, political prisoners struggled. The weakest, the dokodyagi, waited for death. Barter was life, bread for tobacco, a needle, or protection. Stealing was common, but deadly if caught. Yet, even here, resilience flickered. Secret friendships, shared food, poetry recited in the dark. The Gulag reshaped the Soviet landscape. Cities like Magadan and Karaganda were built by prisoners, their populations forever changed. Today, many of these towns are in decline, their industries obsolete, their people leaving. The crumbling infrastructure is a living museum of a failed system. The human cost endures, etched into the land and memory. Stalin's death in 1953 signaled the Gulag's decline. Beria, head of the secret police, admitted the camps were an economic and social disaster, initiating mass amnesties. Prisoner uprisings in Vorkuta and elsewhere showed the system was breaking down. Khrushchev's secret speech denounced Stalin's terror, paving the way for dismantling the camps. Millions were released. The Gulag's economic functions shifted to civilian ministries. The system's collapse revealed its moral and economic bankruptcy. The Soviet Union's dream of forced labor progress had become a nightmare of waste and suffering. When the USSR fell in 1991, the rusting remains of the Gulag stood as a final verdict. The promise of paradise built on coercion ended in silence and ruin.